I still remember that day. It started like any other ordinary morning. I had woken up, made my tea, and looked out the window at the soft drizzle falling on our garden. Everything seemed calm. But deep down, a small, uneasy feeling was growing inside me. I had been looking forward to tonight, the family dinner, a tradition we had for years. I thought it was something we all shared, a way to laugh together, to catch up, to feel close. But when I called my daughter in law to confirm, her words stopped me cold. "Oh, you don't need to come tonight," she said. I froze. I repeated the question, just to be sure. She repeated the same words, with a casual tone that hid no regret. I smiled. I didn't cry. I didn't shout. I just nodded. All right, maybe another time. And then I hung up. I sat in my quiet house, staring at the teacup in my hands, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the weather outside. How could they, my family, leave me out? Not by mistake, not by accident. They chose this. The thought kept turning over in my mind. Why? Was it something I did? Something I said? Or had I been invisible to them all along? I poured another cup of tea, the steam rising and blurring my vision. I tried to distract myself with small chores, tidying the kitchen, watering the plants, but nothing worked. Every tick of the clock echoed the loneliness that was settling into my chest. That night, I didn't just feel left out. I felt unseen, forgotten. And yet, as I sat there quietly, I realized something else. This silence, this absence, was also a moment to reflect. I thought about all the dinners we had shared over the years. The laughter, the small arguments, the quiet moments of understanding. And suddenly, being left out wasn't just about tonight. It was about realizing that even the people you love most can drift away, sometimes without warning. And in that quiet moment, alone with my thoughts and the sound of rain against the window, I made a promise to myself. I would try to understand before I let this hurt define me. My family was, well, like most families. Busy, imperfect, full of love in their own ways, but sometimes distant without meaning to be. I have two children, my son and my daughter. My son is married to my daughter-in-law, and together they have a little boy, full of energy and curiosity. My daughter lives in another city now, focused on her career, but she calls every weekend. Her voice brings warmth, a connection that bridges the miles between us. After my husband passed away years ago, I stayed in the house we had shared. It felt empty without him, but also familiar, comforting. I couldn't leave the memories behind, and neither could my children. I spent my days tending to small routines. Cooking, reading, checking on neighbors, walking in the garden. My life had a quiet rhythm. I wasn't lonely, exactly, but I always felt a subtle awareness of the spaces around me. Spaces filled with laughter, with routines, with shared lives that I wasn't always a part of. I always believed I was a part of it all, that my presence mattered, that my advice, my stories, my simple acts of love counted for something. But that night, the realization that I wasn't invited to dinner shattered that belief. It wasn't just about a meal. The monthly family dinner had become a ritual, a moment of connection. My son would recount stories from work. My daughter-in-law would laugh at jokes I barely understood. And my grandson would peek shyly from behind her, his wide eyes curious and trusting. I would sit quietly, soaking it all in, feeling the warmth of being together. That morning, when I received the words, "You don't need to come tonight," I tried to mask my feelings.
I smiled at my reflection in the mirror and whispered to myself, maybe tonight isn't meant to be. That's okay. But inside, a heaviness had settled, stubborn and unshakable. Weeks before, I had noticed subtle changes. My son called less often, sometimes hurriedly, with short sentences. My daughter-in-law's smiles were polite, but they didn't reach her eyes. At first, I ignored it, telling myself people get busy, life moves forward. But little by little, these small signals accumulated, building a quiet wall of distance between us. I remembered the first family dinner after my husband passed. The house had felt unbearably empty, but that meal had filled the silence with shared laughter, memories, and small confessions. And now, to be left out, to be excluded so casually, felt like being erased from everything we had built together. I moved through the house, picking up small reminders. A scarf left on the chair, a mug on the counter, a letter I had written but never sent. Each item reminded me of my presence in their lives and of how invisible I had become. I tried to convince myself it wasn't permanent. Maybe tomorrow would be different. Maybe it was a mistake. But a quiet, persistent fear lingered. Had I truly become someone who no longer belonged here? I spent that day in reflection. I prepared my meals carefully, cleaned with slow, deliberate movements, and walked in the garden, watching the rain fall softly on the leaves. Each act was a small attempt to hold on to a sense of purpose, to remind myself that I still mattered, even if they didn't see it. And yet, no matter what I did, the absence of their invitation echoed louder than anything else. The dinner wasn't just food on a table. It was a symbol of belonging, of recognition, of family. And I had been left out. In the days that followed, I tried to make sense of everything. I wanted answers, but I didn't want to push too hard. I didn't want to be seen as nagging or demanding. I didn't want to be the difficult mother-in-law that people whisper about. I just wanted to understand why I had been left out. I began noticing small signs everywhere, signs that had probably been there all along, but I had been too absorbed in love and routine to notice. My son would call, but his voice was hurried, clipped. "How are you?" he'd ask, and before I could respond, he would say, "Okay, gotta go." My daughter-in-law would smile at me politely, but her eyes seemed distant, distracted. I remembered the last dinner we had shared. She had been talking about plans for the weekend, plans I wasn't invited to, plans I wasn't even asked about. I stayed silent, listening, feeling a pang of exclusion I couldn't shake. "Do you want some tea?" I asked one afternoon, keeping my voice gentle, careful. "I'm fine, thanks," she replied, quickly returning to her phone. I wanted to speak, to ask what had changed, but I didn't. I had learned over the years that words spoken in anger or frustration often hurt more than they heal. So I remained quiet, holding my feelings inside, letting them simmer like a pot just below the boil. But inside, the pain grew. It wasn't anger I felt. It was exclusion, a quiet, gnawing sadness that made my chest ache. I replayed every interaction in my mind, every word I had said or done, searching for the mistake I must have made. But I couldn't find one. Nothing stood out as wrong. The truth, I realized slowly, is that people drift. Sometimes it isn't a single event. It isn't even a conscious choice. Life moves forward. Priorities change, bonds fray quietly over time, and sometimes you wake up one day and realize the people you thought would always be there are no longer close in the same way. I tried to keep my dignity intact. I smiled at neighbors. I visited friends. I wrote letters I never sent. I cooked meals for myself and made them beautiful, even if no one else would taste them. I reminded myself that my life had value, my love had meaning, even if it wasn't recognized in the way I wanted. But the loneliness lingered. It settled into the quiet corners of the house, into the pauses between words on the phone, into the evenings when the light dimmed and the house was empty. One evening, I found myself at the window, watching my son and daughter-in-law through the frosted glass, laughing together over dinner. My heart ached, not with anger, but with longing. I wanted to be part of it again. I wanted them to see me, to include me, to remember that I had been here all along, quietly loving them, patiently waiting for moments like this. I called my daughter that night, my voice barely above a whisper. "Did you know about the dinner?" "No, I'm so sorry, Mom. I didn't know they told you not to come," she said, her voice full of concern. Her words brought comfort, but not enough. Comfort doesn't erase the sting of absence. Comfort doesn't fill the space of being unseen. As days passed, I noticed even more subtle changes. The small greetings became briefer. The casual chats I once looked forward to turned into hurried exchanges. I watched from the edges, not out of resentment, but out of a quiet hope that maybe, just maybe, things would return to the way they were. But each time, the door remained closed, sometimes literally, sometimes metaphorically. I would knock lightly, and the world inside would keep moving without me. I realized then that the real pain wasn't just being left out, it was feeling invisible, a part of the family in name only, but not in presence. I began to question myself. Had I been too strict, too cautious, too quiet, too opinionated? I couldn't find a reason. Yet the feelings persisted. I realized that sometimes there's no simple reason. People change, situations change, relationships shift. And no matter how much love you give, it may not always be returned in the way you hope. And so I waited. I waited quietly, patiently, for something. A gesture, a word, a sign that I still mattered.
The breaking point came quietly, in the way life sometimes delivers its hardest lessons, not with a shout, but with a soft, undeniable weight. It was a Friday evening. I had prepared my small meal and sat near the window, watching the rain fall. I wasn't expecting anything, but a part of me still held on to hope. Hope that my son or daughter-in-law might remember me, might include me, might ask me to join them, even at the last moment. The sound of laughter drifted from the house next door, carrying the warmth and closeness I longed for. And then I heard voices from my own home, the familiar chatter of my family at the dining table. I froze. I felt a lump in my throat. My hands gripped the windowsill as I strained to listen, hoping to catch a word, a smile, some acknowledgement of my presence. But there was nothing for me. No invitation, no glance, no gesture. I decided, with a trembling resolve, to walk over. Perhaps I could offer help with the dishes afterward. Perhaps I could simply sit quietly and be present. Maybe then they would see me. Maybe then I would belong again. I stepped out into the drizzle, my heart heavy but determined. With each step, I rehearsed my words, polite, calm, non-accusing. I knocked lightly on the door. My son opened it, his face briefly surprised, then composed. "Oh, you're here," he said, forcing a smile. I thought I might join," I said softly. She looked at me, her eyes flicking quickly, avoiding contact. "Mom, maybe another time," she replied, and closed the door almost immediately. I stood there in the rain, drenched not just by the water, but by the reality of their distance. My chest felt tight, my hands shook slightly, and for a moment I thought I might cry. But I didn't. I took a slow, deep breath and turned back toward my home. That night, alone in my quiet house,
I replayed the moment over and over. How could they treat me like this? How could the people I had devoted my life to, who had depended on me for years, choose to exclude me so casually? The pain was deep, but it was no longer about anger or resentment. It was about understanding the truth. Sometimes family isn't only about love. Sometimes family is about expectations, misunderstandings, and unspoken decisions that leave some people on the outside. I thought about all the dinners I had prepared, the stories I had told, the advice I had offered, and I realized something. My love had been constant, but theirs had shifted without warning. Not because I had failed, but because life had moved them in a different direction. I spent the night reflecting, writing down my feelings in a small journal I kept for moments like this. Each word poured out the ache, the disappointment, the quiet sorrow that had settled in my chest. I wrote about the times I had felt invisible, about the longing for connection, about the subtle realization that sometimes being left out is not a punishment, but a signal to look inward, to find strength within yourself. For the first time, I saw a faint light in the darkness. Maybe this exclusion wasn't the end. Maybe it was a turning point. Not for them, but for me. A moment to understand that my sense of belonging could not always rely on others' recognition. I could choose to find peace, to rebuild my identity, to nurture my own spirit, even when the door was closed. And with that thought, I closed the journal, hugged myself gently, and whispered, I will be okay. I will be enough, even if they don't see it yet. That night, as the rain softened and the wind quieted, I felt something shift inside me, a mix of sorrow and strength, loss and acceptance. It was the beginning of a journey that would not erase the pain, but would teach me how to carry it with grace.
In the days that followed, life continued in its quiet rhythm. The house felt the same, yet everything had shifted for me. I still saw my family, still heard their laughter drifting from the dining room, but I no longer expected to be included. At first, the emptiness was sharp. Each mealtime, each casual conversation reminded me of my absence. But slowly, I began to notice something I hadn't before: the resilience within myself. The moments I had spent alone, reflecting, writing, and caring for my small routines, had begun to build a quiet strength. I started reaching out, but differently this time. Not with expectations, not with hopes that I would be invited, but simply to connect in small, meaningful ways. I sent my daughter little notes, shared a recipe with my son, and found ways to talk to my grandson, even if it was just through a quick phone call. One afternoon, my son came by my garden. He didn't mention the dinner, didn't apologize directly, but he stayed a while, helping me trim the roses. I noticed the hesitation in his eyes, the unspoken tension, but I also felt a small thread of connection returning. "Mom," he said quietly, "I've been busy. Things have been different lately. I didn't mean to hurt you." I nodded, choosing calm over confrontation. "I know," I replied softly. "Sometimes life just moves differently, but that's okay." And in that simple exchange, I realized something important. Forgiveness wasn't about them. It wasn't even about being included again. Forgiveness was about freeing myself from the weight of resentment, about reclaiming my own peace, about understanding that love doesn't always look the way we expect. I began to focus on the small joys I had ignored while waiting for validation. I spent more time in the garden, noticed the birds returning after the rain,
and cooked meals simply for the pleasure of creating something nourishing. I wrote letters I didn't send, not as reminders to anyone else, but as a way to release the feelings that had been bottled inside me. One evening, my daughter called. She shared stories from her city, her laughter spilling over the phone. I listened, truly listened, without longing or expectation. And in that listening, I felt connection again. Not the same as before, but different, gentle, enduring. I also began to see my daughter-in-law differently. I realized she wasn't excluding me out of malice. She was navigating her own life, her own stress, her own pressures. The dinner hadn't been an attack. It had been a reflection of shifting priorities, not of love lost. By letting go of the expectation that I had to be included, I started to notice moments of warmth. A glance from my grandson, a smile from my son, a small acknowledgement from my daughter-in-law. These moments, tiny as they were, became enough. I learned that belonging is not always about physical presence. Sometimes it is about being seen, understood, and accepted for who you are, even when you are not at the cable. And slowly, I felt the ache of being left out transform into a quiet, steady strength. I realized that my heart could hold both sadness and gratitude at the same time. Sadness for the absence, gratitude for the love that remained. And in that balance, I began to feel whole again.
Time passed, and slowly life found its rhythm again. The sharp ache of being left out softened into a quiet understanding. I still noticed when I wasn't included, and yes, the sting remained for a moment, but it no longer defined me. I spent more time observing the small joys in my daily life. The way sunlight spilled across the kitchen counter in the morning, the gentle rustle of leaves in the garden, the laughter of children playing nearby. These moments reminded me that life has its own quiet beauty, even when it doesn't unfold exactly as we hope. One evening, my grandson ran up to me with a drawing he had made. "Look, Grandma, I drew us together!" he exclaimed. In that simple gesture, I felt something I had been longing for: connection, love, and belonging, not through words or invitations, but through the innocence of a child's heart. I realized then that love takes many forms. It doesn't always arrive when or how we expect it. Sometimes it is quiet. Sometimes it is subtle. And sometimes it is something we carry within ourselves, not just something we receive from others. I also learned to forgive, not because anyone asked for forgiveness, not because I wanted to erase the hurt, but because carrying it endlessly would have weighed me down. Forgiveness became my way of finding peace, my way of reclaiming my own joy. When my daughter-in-law finally smiled at me in a way that reached her eyes, I felt no anger, no lingering resentment. I felt understanding. She had her own life, her own struggles, her own perspective, and I had mine. We could share space again, quietly, without expectation, without pressure. Looking back, I understand now that being left out wasn't a punishment. It was a lesson in patience, in self-worth, in the subtle strength that comes from standing quietly in your own truth. I learned that sometimes the most important relationships we nurture are the ones we carry within ourselves. And so I sit here in the evening, a cup of tea in my hands, watching the soft light fade from the sky. I feel a deep sense of calm. I am still part of my family, even if not in the way I imagined. I am still loved, even when love takes quiet, unspoken forms. And I am still whole, even when the table is not set for me. Life moves forward, people change, and moments pass. But in the silence, in the absence, I discovered something vital: the strength to be content, the courage to forgive, and the gentle warmth of hope that tomorrow will bring new opportunities for connection. And in that quiet understanding, I smile. Not because the hurt has disappeared, but because I know that love, in all its forms, endures even when it is unseen.